Have you ever had that feeling, where words just aren't enough? Like there's this big jumble of thoughts and feelings swirling around inside, and you try to put it into language, and it just, I don't know, loses something in the translation.
Oh, absolutely. I think we've all been there. Sometimes words just fall short.
And that's what's so cool about what we're diving into today, right? It's all about how art can be this other language, and sometimes even a more effective language than just talking for expressing what's going on inside us.
Yeah, it's like a direct line to what we're thinking and feeling, even when we can't quite articulate it with words.
So for you, listening, get ready to explore how bringing art into therapy, and even just into your everyday life, can open up these surprisingly deep levels of understanding and communication.
That's right. We're diving deep into the book Artful Therapy today. And it's such a great resource for understanding the core principles and the practical ways that we can actually use art in therapy. And it looks at a whole spectrum of techniques and theories about how engaging with art, whether that's creating it or just responding to it, can really benefit people of all ages and backgrounds.
And this book, Artful Therapy, it really does cover a lot of ground, doesn't it? It looks at how you can use art for assessment, how it works in therapy with adults, in therapy with kids, in family therapy, in group therapy, even how it connects with other creative things like drama and writing and music and our own, the images that pop up in our heads.
Right? It even gets into things like guided imagery. And what really struck me about this book is that it's geared towards people who aren't necessarily art therapists themselves,
Right.
which makes these tools feel a lot more accessible. It's like, oh, maybe I could actually try some of this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really the mission of our deep dive for you today, right? We're going to pull out the key insights from Artful Therapy and really help you understand why and how art can be such a valuable tool for personal growth, for working through emotions and just communicating what's happening internally.
That's exactly it. And you absolutely do not need to be a professional artist to get something out of this.
Not at all. And get ready for some aha moments as we explore this.
I think there will be a few.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's start with the why. Why even bother adding art into the mix, right? What can art do that just talking can't?
Well, the book lays out some really powerful reasons. One of the core insights is that words simply can't capture everything, right?
Right.
There's some feelings, some experiences, like think about the vividness of dreams or really intense emotions, overwhelming emotions, where language is just, it struggles to really express the full depth of that experience. And the book is this really striking example. There's a woman named Mrs. Lord who was so distressed that she could barely speak.
Yeah.
But she was able to draw very quickly and simply what she was feeling. And she created these images, which she later titled Shock and Confusion.
Wow.
And that visual, those drawings immediately conveyed the intensity of her internal state in a way that words couldn't at that moment.
So powerful.
Words often fail to capture the visceral nature of trauma or the abstract world of dreams. Art can step in where language falters.
That makes total sense. It's like trying to describe a scent to someone who has no sense of smell, right?
Right.
You can use all the adjectives, you can try all these metaphors, but it's not the same experience.
Not even close.
And Artful Therapy also talks about the dark side, and I thought that was kind of an interesting way to put it.
Yep.
So what's the dark side of, our inner world, and why is art a good way to engage with it?
Well, what's really fascinating about this concept of the dark side is that art acts as a symbolic buffer. It lets us engage with those difficult emotions that we all have without the immediate vulnerability of confessing them directly to someone. It's like this safe distance for expressing those things that are hard to talk about, maybe even things that feel shameful, emotions, or even impulses, those things that we tend to keep hidden away.
Right, that we don't want to admit to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And because it's symbolic, because you're not directly stating it, it's like, here's my shame, here's my rage. It allows people to engage with these parts of themselves through their artwork long before they might feel ready or able to talk about them openly.
Right.
It's like dipping your toes in the water.
It's like, testing the waters in this much less threatening way, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
It's almost like that emotion is filtered through the act of creation, making it just a little less raw, a little less personally exposing.
Right. You're not putting it all out there right away. And that can make a huge difference.
And the book even touches on the idea that art might actually speed up the therapeutic process, right?
It does.
I mean, that's a pretty significant claim.
It is a big claim. And the book acknowledges that, it's hard to definitively prove because therapy is so complex and there are so many factors involved.
Right.
But The experience that's shared in Artful Therapy, and by many therapists in general, is that art can often bypass our defenses, those walls we put up,
Yeah.
and tap into deeper issues more quickly. You even mentioned, having an experience early in your career where just offering art materials to people led to some really significant reflection for them, even before you had formal training in psychotherapy.
Mm, mm.
And that really highlights the inherent power of this medium.
It really does. I remember being quite surprised by the depth of insight that would come up just from someone working with clay or, doing a drawing. It's like things would emerge that you just wouldn't expect.
It's like it unlocks something. And another point that the book makes, which I think is really important, is that art can really reduce self-consciousness. And
Mm.
that's huge
Yeah, that's a big one.
because that's a barrier for a lot of people when it comes to therapy. They feel
Mhm.
self-conscious, they feel exposed.
Exactly.
And because art feels less direct and more private than just talking face to face, it allows for this symbolic disguise, right?
Yeah.
People can express things without even fully being consciously aware of the meaning themselves until later on, until they're ready to see it.
Wow.
And the concept of the triangle, the patient, the therapist, and the artwork, that's really key here.
Yeah.
Imagine that dynamic, right?
Hmm.
Instead of just you and the therapist sitting there staring at each other, now there's this artwork in between, a shared object of attention.
Hmm.
It's like having a third person in the room.
Right.
And it can really ease the intensity of that direct self-disclosure for people who really struggle with eye contact or just that direct vulnerability.
Yeah, it creates a buffer, doesn't it?
It does.
Like a shared focal point that isn't the person themselves. It's not me sitting here, you know, bearing my soul. It's like, no, we're both looking at this thing we created.
Exactly, and gives you something concrete to talk about.
And the book even hints at a neurological basis for why art can be so effective, and it talks about enhancing integration. What does that mean?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The idea is that the creative process can involve and integrate both the left and right hemispheres of the brain, those two halves.
Right.
And this interplay, this connection between the logical side of the brain and the more intuitive emotional side may actually contribute to that deeper level of understanding and integration that art can facilitate.
So it's like you're engaging both sides of the brain, and that leads to a more complete processing of emotions and experiences, I guess.
Exactly. It's not just stuck in one side. And then finally, in terms of the why art is so powerful, Artful Therapy talks about playfulness, even something as simple as doodling.
Right. Like you're just messing around, not trying to create a masterpiece.
Exactly. And even those seemingly insignificant doodles can reveal unconscious content. And it reminded me of something.
Yeah, what's that?
Well, the book references this observation by Ernst Kreis, who said that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the ideas hidden in doodles are often ideas that the ego wants to liberate itself from.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because it's such a casual, seemingly unimportant activity,
Hmm.
there's less self-monitoring, right?
Right.
You're not censoring yourself.
You're not like, oh, should I draw this? Should I not?
Exactly. And that allows those unconscious thoughts and feelings to just kind of surface in unexpected ways.
It's like the mind slips things out when it thinks no one's paying attention.
Exactly. It's like, oh, I didn't mean to say that, but there it is.
So we're seeing how art offers this whole range of benefits that goes beyond just talking. But for someone who's not an art therapist, how do you even begin to incorporate this? What
Right.
are the practical first steps? Where do you start?
Well, the book dedicates a good chunk to this very question, to getting started. And it emphasizes having some basic art materials available. Things for drawing, like pencils, crayons, markers, painting supplies like watercolors, tempera paints, even finger paints, and materials for modeling like plasticine and clay. And it stresses that you don't need professional artist-grade materials.
Right.
But having decent quality supplies is important because you don't want the materials themselves to be a source of frustration, right? Imagine trying to express yourself with crayons that barely leave a mark or paper that tears as soon as you touch it. That's just going to add to the difficulty.
Absolutely. The quality of the materials, it can really impact the experience in a negative way.
Yeah, it can be really discouraging.
And what about the physical space, right? Do you need a dedicated art studio to do this?
Not at all.
Yeah.
The book mentions various working surfaces. Even a simple table with a washable top is often sufficient. You can always cover it if you're worried about making a mess.
Right.
Easels are nice, but definitely not essential. Although they can be helpful, especially for painting. But really, the main idea is to create a comfortable, practical space where the focus can be on the art making itself and not on the logistics.
And I remember the book making a really crucial point about the therapist's role in all of this, right? It's not just about handing over the art supplies and saying, go for it.
Exactly, exactly. Artful therapy really encourages therapists to familiarize themselves with the materials firsthand, to actually experiment and play around with them themselves.
Mm.
And by trying them out, you get a much better sense of what the experience might be like for your clients, including any potential frustrations or things that are particularly satisfying to work with.
Right.
It also just makes you more comfortable offering them and talking about them with your clients.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And when it comes to actually introducing art to someone, the book has some really helpful suggestions. Emphasize a non-threatening approach. Don't make it seem like some kind of test. Offering choices of materials is really important, as is explaining the potential benefits. Like, hey, this might help you think visually, or this might give you another way to communicate what's going on inside. Or even, some people find that this actually leads to faster relief from difficult emotions.
It's about presenting it in a positive and accessible way, not as some kind of intimidating artistic endeavor where you have to be good at it to participate.
Exactly. It's not about being good at art.
And what about that very common anxiety that people have about their artistic abilities, right? I mean, I know I'd be hesitant if someone asked me to draw something in therapy, like, oh, I can't draw.
Oh, yeah. The book addresses that head on.
Does it? Okay.
Because it's so common, it suggests acknowledging that it might feel awkward and even asking the person what their specific worries are. And most people will say something like, oh, I can't draw.
Yeah, that's my go-to.
Exactly. It's like a default response.
Yeah.
And so reassuring them that artistic skill is not the goal, that it's about expression, it's about exploration, that's crucial.
Right, and it's about the process, not the product.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can even share your own experiences trying out the materials,
Right.
even if you don't consider yourself an artist. And Artful Therapy also mentions alternatives for people who are really resistant to the idea of creating something, like responding to existing images, like postcards or magazine photos. That can be a less intimidating first step for some folks.
That's a great point. So those are some really helpful tips for getting started. Now, once someone is actually engaged in making art, they've picked up the paintbrush or the clay or whatever,
Right.
what do you as the facilitator do?
Right.
How do you observe and reflect on what's happening? Because I imagine there's a lot more to it than just saying, oh, that's a pretty picture.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting, where the real depth comes in.
Okay.
And the book emphasizes the importance of observing the individual during the process of creation, not just focusing on the finished product. So pay attention to how they approach the materials, their decision-making, how they interact with you around the task, and the sequence of their actions.
So, like, are they hesitant? Are they bold? Do they erase a lot?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Do they talk while they work? And if so, how does what they're saying relate to what they're creating?
Right, right.
The book gives a really compelling example of this child, Rose, who's finger painting a picture that she calls Taco the horse.
Taco the horse, okay.
And by observing her process, the messiness of it, what she's saying as she's working, the series of images that she creates, a lot of information about her inner world, her family relationships, just comes pouring out.
I see. It's like those details become clues.
Exactly. And noticing omissions, exaggerations, or when someone covers something over in their artwork, these can all be really significant.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just the final piece, it's the whole journey of creation that's meaningful.
Exactly. And what happens after the art making is complete? How do you reflect on it with the person?
Right, that's a big question.
It is. And reflection is absolutely key. And the therapist's role here is to guide that process. The book stresses asking open-ended questions rather than jumping in with interpretations, Things like, tell me about your artwork, or what stands out to you. Encourage the person to share their own perspective and feelings about what they've created.
So you're letting them lead the way.
Exactly. You're following their lead. And Artful Therapy talks about this idea of creative interviewing, which is basically using a flexible approach to explore the artwork, trying different questions to see what resonates with the individual. It's like you're exploring this new landscape together. And importantly, even if you, as the therapist, have strong reactions to the artwork, the book advises exploring what the patient imagines you think about it, rather than imposing your own opinions.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not about saying, oh, this color makes me think of this, or this shape reminds me of that.
Exactly. It's keeping the focus on the individual's experience. You don't want to influence their understanding of their own work.
That makes so much sense. And what about displaying the artwork? I feel like that could be a sensitive area.
It absolutely can be. The book emphasizes that the person who created the art always owns it, and they should be in control of whether or not they want to display it.
Right, of course.
For some people, sharing their work can be really empowering. It can be a way to build confidence, but it should always be their choice. And if the artwork is going to be shared with other professionals, like in a team meeting or something, getting the patient's clear permission is essential.
It's about respecting their privacy as much as their desire to be seen and acknowledged. Okay, so we've covered the why and how of getting started and reflecting. Now, artful therapy also goes into how art can be used in different therapeutic contexts. Let's start with assessment. How is art used in an assessment setting?
Well, in assessment, art can be a really valuable projective technique. Think of it as a way to reveal unconscious thoughts and feelings through creative expression. And this can happen either by asking someone to create something, like draw a person or draw their family, or by having them respond to existing visual materials, like choosing and arranging magazine pictures and talking about what those images mean to them.
So it's not just about making art from scratch, it can also be about responding to existing images. That's interesting.
Exactly. And the book mentions lots of examples of these kinds of drawings and collages and how you might look for certain themes or patterns, although it also brings up the ongoing discussion about how standardized these approaches can or should be.
Standardized drawing tasks, it sounds a bit like trying to create a rigid set of rules for something that's inherently so open and personal.
Exactly. While some standardized projected drawing tests exist, with specific instructions and interpretation guidelines, a lot of art therapists question these more rigid approaches.
Hmm.
Because they see the incredible variety in how people create, they often prefer more open-ended methods that allow for greater individual expression and choice of materials. And offering a wider range of art supplies and paper sizes can actually lead to more informative results and reduce anxiety for the person being assessed.
Makes sense. You're giving them more freedom to express themselves authentically.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
The book also points out the significance of what's left out of drawings, like a child who doesn't draw themselves in a family picture.
Oh, right. That would definitely be a clue to explore further.
Right, and it mentions using simple visual prompts like scribbles or dots that can help overcome the fear of a blank page and just spark creativity in an assessment context.
So it's really about using art as a starting point for understanding rather than just a checklist of symbols to interpret.
Exactly, it's a springboard for exploration and dialogue.
Now, how does art play out in actual therapy sessions with adults? What does that look like in practice?
Well, in adult therapy, inviting free expression through art can be incredibly powerful. It allows people to explore topics and themes that are important to them. And it can be especially helpful in accessing and processing difficult memories, especially traumatic memories. The book actually suggests that drawing can sometimes feel like a less direct and therefore less forbidden way of telling about trauma than talking directly.
Right. It's like there's a layer of safety there.
Exactly. And the act of creating something, of giving that trauma a visual form, can help to process it and even lessen some of those intrusive symptoms.
Wow. So art can actually have a therapeutic effect on trauma symptoms.
It can. And artful therapy really emphasizes that art isn't limited to one specific type of therapy. Whether you're working from a psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, behavioral, systemic, or even a more integrated approach, art can be incorporated in various ways, from exploring unconscious conflicts to increasing self-awareness to practicing new ways of thinking or behaving through imagery.
It sounds like art can be a really flexible tool that adapts to different therapeutic styles and goals. And what about the unique role of art in therapy with children? I imagine that's quite different given children's stage of development.
Oh, absolutely. The book highlights how art is just such a natural and comfortable way for children to express themselves, especially since their verbal abilities are still developing.
Right.
Providing a good range of age-appropriate materials is really important. So things like different kinds of markers, chalk, plasticine, model magic.
Right. Things that are fun to touch and manipulate.
Exactly. And when we're looking at and trying to understand children's art, it's so important to keep their developmental level in mind so we don't misinterpret something that's age-appropriate as a sign of a problem.
Right, you don't want to jump to conclusions just because a child's drawing doesn't look realistic.
Exactly. For example, young children's use of color or size isn't necessarily realistic, and that's completely normal. The book even points out that there can be a unique logic in some children's drawings, like a child who draws only the moving parts of a ball player.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's not necessarily confusion about body image. It's actually a really sensible way for them to show the action, to highlight what's important to them about that scene.
Right, they're focusing on the essence of the movement.
Exactly. It's a really important reminder not to impose adult ways of understanding onto children's creative expression.
So we need to meet them where they are developmentally and appreciate the unique logic of their art. Now, the book also talks about using art in family and group therapy. How does that dynamic change when you introduce art into those settings?
Well, in family and group therapy, art can be a fantastic way to facilitate communication and to really address the dynamics within the family or the group. Collaborative art projects, like creating a shared mural together or working silently on a single drawing space, can reveal so much about how people interact, the power dynamics within the group, and feelings that might not be spoken out loud.
Right, it brings those unspoken dynamics to the surface.
Exactly. The book shares an example of a family creating a drawing that very clearly showed the mother's perceived intrusiveness by the other family members.
Wow, so it was right there in the picture.
And that led to a really important discussion that they probably wouldn't have had otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Interactive art tasks, like the master-servant game, where family members take turns directing each other in creating art, can also build empathy and awareness of how others experience things.
Oh, that's a great idea.
In group settings, art activities can be great as warm-ups, introductions, and as a way to lower anxiety in the early stages of therapy, because it often feels more playful and less confrontational than just talking.
It sounds like art can be a really effective way to bypass some of the usual communication challenges that can come up in family and group therapy.
Exactly. It provides a shared experience and a different way to connect. And going beyond visual art, Artful Therapy also touches on bringing in other creative modalities.
Right, so it's not just limited to drawing and painting.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The book briefly introduces the idea of incorporating drama, like using puppets or role-playing, writing, through journals or poetry, music, and mental imagery into therapy.
So it's like expanding the toolkit of creative expression to meet different needs and preferences.
Exactly. And each of these has its own unique benefits and can work really well alongside art making. For example, drama can help people externalize inner conflicts by acting them out. Writing can offer a different way to reflect and process emotions. Music can evoke feelings and create a certain atmosphere.
And paying attention to the images that come up in our minds, that can be another powerful way to access and explore our inner world.
Absolutely. And the book even includes the patient's own reflections on how writing and art served different but equally helpful purposes for her. It's about having a wider range of creative tools to work with.
And finally, Artful Therapy addresses the practical aspect of working with art therapists directly. What's the best way to go about that?
Well, the book outlines several ways to collaborate with art therapists, including consultation, co-therapy, and making referrals.
Right, because art therapists have that specialized training and expertise in this field.
Exactly. Consulting with an art therapist can help you understand a patient's artwork, design appropriate art-based activities, or figure out solutions to any challenges you might be facing. Co-leading a group with an art therapist brings together different skills and perspectives. And in some situations, referring a patient to an art therapist for more focused treatment might be the most beneficial path.
It's about recognizing and respecting their specific knowledge and experience. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Artful Therapy, what are the key takeaways you think are most important for our listener to keep in mind?
I think the main things to remember are that art offers a really powerful, versatile, and accessible way to express ourselves, to communicate, and to explore our inner world in a therapeutic context. And this is true for everyone, no matter their artistic abilities. It has this unique capacity to get around the limitations of verbal language, to tap into those deeper emotions, and to foster self-understanding in ways that just talking sometimes can't achieve.
And this isn't just relevant for formal therapy, right? These core ideas we've been talking about, they have value beyond the therapist's office.
Absolutely. The principles of using art for expression and self-discovery can absolutely be applied in your own personal reflections, in journaling, or even just in how you communicate with the people around you. It's about recognizing the value of this visual language in enriching your understanding of yourself and the world.
That's a fantastic point. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, here's a final thought for you to consider. What thoughts or feelings might you discover if you picked up a pen, some clay, or even just allowed the images in your mind to surface? Could incorporating a little more visual language enrich your own understanding of yourself and the world around you? We encourage you to experiment with some simple creative activities without judgment and just see what emerges. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Thanks for listening.